I grew up in the glorious 80s, the decade of the action figure. And back then, every time you walked into a toy store and you saw some new line created, it was like you were getting a glimpse into a new and fascinating fantasy world. Some sort of world threatened by some horrific monster or villain, and that you were going to be a part of that conflict, that you were going to take part in that conflict, and it might go on for years, and it might become one of your favorite stories that you participated in for years to come. And some of these went on and became icons. They are the toys that we play with today. And others were not so lucky, and they burned brightly, and for a short period of time they captured our imagination. We hoped they would expand and become as incredible and have the scope and lore of something like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe or G.I. Joe, in a time when creators were working to create the new big thing that would become an icon. Each one of these represents somebody's dream to become one of these iconic stories, and is within itself a little fantasy world with characters and dramas and lore and possibilities. So we're going to talk about the 50 greatest action figure lines of the 80s. And if we're talking about the 50 greatest action figure lines of the 80s, let's face it, we're talking about the 50 greatest action figure lines of all time. This is the 50 greatest action figure lines of the 80s ranked. Now, couple things here. One, by the 80s, I kind of mean 1977 to like 1990, right? And I think that a lot of times when you talk about the 80s, so you talk about the greatest slasher movies of all time, you'd probably be including things from 78. If you talk about the greatest, the 80s music, you'd be definitely talking about 77 to, 85. That's when the Talking Heads and the Police and all those. When I think about 80s music, honestly, a lot of times it's the late 70s. But anyway, for the rules here, we will stick to things that at least had to be alive in the 80s still. This is an attempt to, get them all in. I did an earlier version of this where I talked about the 20 greatest toy lines of all time. And one of the comments I got was, hey, you missed this one, you missed this one, you missed this one. And I agree with you. You're right. A lot of those I missed because I wasn't thinking, and I forgot about them, or they weren't on my radar at the time. Some of them not because I didn't really play with them, or I didn't really have that many of them, so I didn't really think of them. Some were not included because when you got 20, you can only include 20. In this list, I'm going to try to include as many of them as I can, and we're going to go all the way through a tour of what you had as a kid, what you loved, and I'm sure I'll still miss some. So tell me what I missed on the in the comments below. So when we get to the end, right, I'm going to have some criteria in place that we'll discuss of what makes a great toy line and where does it rank. At number 50, we have the Mego Superheroes. Now, Mego was a company that was dominating the industry in the late 70s. And when they had bought up just about every single major IP imaginable. Planet of the Apes, action figures, Marvel superheroes, DC superheroes, just about everything. And then passed on the one big one, which was Star Wars. And that killed them. Also, they had some shady business practices. But one of those things that if you were like me, I was a comic book dork before it was popular to be a comic book dork, and for everybody else in the world became a comic book dork with the Avengers movies. And I wanted superhero action figures. The one way you could get them in the very early 80s was through Mego Superheroes. And they had a massive variety of superhero action figures. These had clothes, and they were a little bit bigger, I believe 8 inches, and they were very well posed, but they had some flaws in that sometimes the clothes, it was a little weird. Like you'd have Spider-Man and his head would be a rubber mask and the rest of him would be clothes. most exciting action figure, and only lasted up until the late 70s, very early 80s. But still, at that time, if you wanted a superhero action figure, Mego was the place to go until we get a little higher on the list and Superpowers arrives. Number 49, we had the Shogun Warriors. Now, these were actually produced in the very late 70s, but all the way till 1980. And so they make it in as one of the 80s toys. You were lucky if you had one of these. These were massive Shogun Warriors. I actually have one still. He is actually one of the guys from Transor Z. If you remember Transor Z, which infamously had a woman who shot missile boobs. I didn't have the missile like that, but I had the other guy. And I had a guy that had a fist that could shoot off, and these were massive. And for me, they were like a thing that you use with your other toys, but they were a whole toy line that were really incredible, and just like having massive giant mech robots, something that could battle against Godzilla. I wish it had gone on further. One of the largest action figures I remember ever owning. I mean, they were so big. I used to beat the crap out of them. I used to fight them myself as a kid. I would get my sisters and myself, and we would just battle, throwing them against the room, and they would shoot punch me in the face. That's how big these things are. And if you had one of these, you were lucky. Next, we have Chuck Norris and the Karate Commandos. Now, this is a line that didn't last very long, but being ninja obsessed, this was a line all about ninjas. And it had Chuck Norris in it. I was a big movie fan of the era. I loved Chuck Norris, and so it was awesome to have him as an action figure. Now, anything with ninjas and ninja weapons. He also had a pretty good car that had some like ninja blades that shot out of the sides, and a little trampoline pack on the trunk that characters could be flung off of, which was really kind of fun. And it was a line that I think could have gone on just a little bit longer. Next in line, we have robotics. And this is a line that exists to this day. When you go to the toy store for the nerdy kids that like the learning and shit, that's where robotics is. But it's actually really awesome. These were sets where you could build robots, and these robots would have different functions. They would have the ability to have claw hands. They could walk, they could move, and you had to build them. So it's a good teaching tool. Is one of the reasons why it survives to this day.
Put the future in your hands. Your own creation to command.
The amazing world of robotics, from the smallest vehicle to the biggest robot. If you can imagine it, you can create it.
The action figures themselves weren't much to speak of. They had the general 4 or 5 points of articulation and were kind of stiff, blocky things. But it's really like one of the lines that the vehicles were the thing. I didn't have much of this. I would like to go back in time and get some. Next, we have number 46. These are not the real Ghostbusters. These are just the Ghostbusters. But this is still an awesome line with a very cool look. It had a great cartoon that went along with it.
Come on there, Ghostbusters.
Jake has a magic backpack and ghost gun. Primeval has a real cape.
Look out, humans.
Pull yourself together, you rusty wreck.
That's spooky.
Ghostbuster figures from Shoppers.
Some very frightening looking villains, and had a really cartoonish look to the figures themselves. A pretty great playset, haunted house, and some good vehicles. And not quite as great as the real Ghostbusters, which would come a little later. It goes a little higher on this list, but still a really great and fun line that had a lot of love for. Next in line, we have GoBots. Yes, GoBots are second-rate Transformers. They are not the only second-rate Transformers. There's about 1,000 things that tried to be Transformers and just didn't succeed. GoBots didn't quite have the scale of Transformers, but they did have a couple really cool ones. I particularly loved Sidekill. Great name. Very cool looking character, and was a lot of fun. You could mix them in with your Transformers, although they were dwarfed in size by the Transformers, making him, not quite as exciting. Next in line, we have Crystar. Now, Crystar was again, had a pretty good comic book put out by Marvel, and actually has been revived in the Marvel line, in the Marvel Legends, as an action figure. What I remember about Crystar is he had a crystal body that had a translucent, could see through, had some great accessories. You had the crystal people and like magma people. I remember the cover of the comic book having this really beautiful painted look. To me, what was great about Crystar is it really did feel like a foreign world that you could get into. It didn't last very long, but it had potential, and I did. You've just discovered a new planet, right? Next, we have Black Star. And if you're gonna GoBots is the poor man's Transformer, well, Black Star was the poor man's He-Man. But Black Star was pretty cool, and you could bring some Black Star figures into your He-Man line, and they would integrate pretty well. What I like about Black Star is every character came with their own little gremlin character. So that was kind of fun, have a little mini gremlin attacking your hero as, the Black Star trying to fight him off. Next, we have Dune. Now, the incredibly boring movie Dune, directed by David Lynch, is a giant disappointment to anybody who loves Dune. But you gotta include this on the list for a couple of things. First of all, you had my boy Sting as an action figure. I'm a big Police fan, and therefore having Sting as an action figure is just awesome. And it's a pretty great sculpt. It looks just like him. Second, as I talked about in this video about R-rated action figures, you've got a really disgusting, bloated pervert, floating pervert for an action figure. So how do you go wrong with that? The Sandworm looked really cool too. I always wanted one of those, never got one. It wasn't quite riding size, but a short-lived line by LJN that was a company that loved to make disturbing action figures. A lot of fun. Next in line, we have Zoids. Now, Zoids, I got to admit, I had no idea these things existed and still exist. These things are still out to this day. And these are motorized building sets where you create walking beasts that are mechanized. What kept these back is I don't think they didn't have a cartoon in the 80s that would, create a storyline for them that the kids would recognize. Otherwise, I don't. Zoids is the Starriers, and that's why I'm gonna put them just in with Zoids right now, sort of sneaking them in the back door. They were sort of simplified Zoids that you didn't have to build, that had simple mechanisms. They had wind-up mechanisms, and this was cool. I remember having a couple of them. Next, we have Battle Beasts, and those were Takara Tomy created these. These were actually supposed to be part of Transformers, and in Asia, this is like they're integrated into the Transformers line. They like ride in the Transformers. But the way we got them is you got them in a packs of 2, a good and a villain, and you would line them up and you would rub the little chest plate, and you'd play like rock paper scissors. So when the chest plate revealed its whatever it had on it, you would find out if you'd won in a rock paper scissors, but it was like air, earth, whatever. They had some great design. They had vehicles that they could ride in, and they had some fun little designs and some good weapons. And so they were kind of a fun little thing to collect. Next in line, we have Starcom. Now, this is a really cool action figure line of smaller figures 2-inch. These guys had magnetic feet and were like astronauts in an intergalactic battle. What was really cool about them is the vehicles all had metal pieces, so you could attach the little astronauts to the metal pieces. They could even, sometimes the magnets would even activate special features. They had wind-up features. They had some pretty innovative vehicles and really interesting designs. The 2-inch figures suffered the same thing that a lot of these, vehicle-focused lines suffer from, which is they're not that distinguishable from one another, and so the figures weren't much, but the magnetic feature really added something, making this one of the more unique toy lines that did not, unfortunately, last very long. Apparently, it went on for years in Europe, but in America, not so long. Number 36, we have the Clash of the Titans action figures. Now, I was obsessed with this movie when it came out. One, PG boob. It had PG boob in it. You might remember this because it was the only boob you'd ever seen at this point. It was like the first boob. Because they got away with putting boobs in. And they had, even though it was like a PG movie, it was early, right? And girl gets out of a tub, it was like the first nudity you saw that you didn't have to sneak around to see. So, for one, I love that movie. Second, the Ray Harryhausen special effects. So they made this into an action figure line. You liked the PG boob too. You remember. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. All right. But some of the designs of this, the Calabos action figure, again, anytime you had that a fantasy world like that, it's big into mythology. And the holy grail of that, of course, is the Kraken figure that makes the list because of that Kraken figure, which is very highly sought after. I had one once. I don't know if I still have it. I hope I do somewhere, but I got to dig it out. That thing was incredible. Anytime you get a big monster, that could be used across every line, and that was really, really exciting. But in general, the biggest tragedy of this, never had a Medusa, never went on to a second run, so it could get some of the cooler moments of Clash of the Titans into the movie. Couldn't get a sequel, couldn't get more side boob. I was very depressed about that. Next line, we have Marvel's Secret Wars. And honestly, this one is low on the list because it just is not a great toy line. But even not being a great toy line, when you have the greatest characters in all of, fantasy worlds, you are the representation of them in this era, we have to put it on the list. A lot of problems with this line. They all have basically the same sculpt. They were kind of bendy, and which was sort of good, even though they had only 5 points of articulation because they were so bendable. They felt like they had a little bit more articulation. Like you could make Daredevil, wrap his arm around someone's neck and sort of choke him out, even though his arm didn't quite bend. It didn't last very long. It had a mystifyingly stupid accessory that was basically all characters came with Captain America shield or a square evil shield that had a hologram inside of it. And so when you had your Captain America, he didn't quite have his shield. He just had a shield that didn't have an American symbol in it. And it wasn't very special because all of them had a shield too. So, you really had to squeeze some, you really had to amp yours up. I remember making some, I'm a big Daredevil fan, so I remember cutting some toothpicks up and making some batons so Daredevil would have his core weapon. Not the greatest line, but it was the only way you got a good Spider-Man figure in the 3 3/4 inch at the time, and so therefore you were thrilled when you got it. Next we have RoboCop. Now you gotta love the fact they made the bloodiest, most awful, and repulsively violent movie into a cartoon and for kids. What was great is these were figures that were 5 points of articulation, similar to a lot of what Kenner would do, but they had a whole great line of villains, and you had some characters from the movie. You had Ed 209 or changed his name. That was like the highlight of this entire series, was just having an Ed 209 action figure. Makes it worth the line existing. But I remember it being pretty fun. Number 35, we have the Bionic 6.
Metal. Die-cast. Invincible. Introducing the Bionic 6 family. Each implanted with bionic parts. Giving them superhuman powers.
This was a short-lived line that was very cool and had the promise of being something really exciting. You had a family that works together to fight crime. There was a pretty good cartoon along with it that made it exciting and got you into it. And then you had your villains. You had Fluffy, the big giant robot gorilla, was sort of like a highlight of the set. And then you had Dr. Scarab and his evil minions of destruction. Was a big fan of the Mechanic and Chopper. It also had some pretty great vehicles. This is one of those that had some promise that, if given a few more runs, maybe could have been great, but kind of fell apart and didn't make it too far. I remember Clunk as a villain was like a melting glob of white crap. Just some really cool designs in there, and something I really wish had survived a little longer than it did. And last, in the 80s, you're competing against all these great ideas to survive. Another one that did not survive, we have number 34, Jace and the Wheeled Warriors. Now, this had an awesome concept, vehicles that you could build upon that were modular. You could construct them, deconstruct them. They had some really great play features. The action figures were not much to speak of, but what's great about these lines that are vehicle based, you got a lot of these vehicle based lines. We got one that's going to be really high up on my list here. And this was one of them where the action figures were really just there to sit in the vehicles. Big problem with Jace and the Wheeled Warriors is there was no Jace. There were just the Wheeled Warriors, and when, every action figure was like a little blobby looking thing that didn't match up with the storyline that was put forth in the cartoon, if you got a chance to see that. But an innovative line in the way the vehicles were constructed, and you were pretty thrilled if you had one of those. I didn't collect many of this. This is one of the ones that skipped past me. So I wasn't a fan of Jace and the Wheeled Warriors. And this is one of those where I look back. I'm like, I want to go back to the time. I want to get me some of those because it looks pretty amazing. Number 33, we have Air Raiders. Now, Air Raiders was a fun concept in that you had, again, little tiny people. So you had a massive war. This is a vehicle-based line. The characters were very small. One of the problems is they were less characters, more like soldiers. They had a generic feel to the characters, and it was more about the vehicles. But the vehicles were all air-powered, so you like stomped on something, they shot across the room. I got a couple of them, and then my interest petered out, and it died a quick death. We have the Sky Commanders. Now, Sky Commanders was a late 80s line by Kenner. And what was so great about this is these were littler characters. They kind of weren't characters. Hard to look at them, and I think maybe where the line falls apart is a lack of identifiable characters, even though it did have a cartoon and a comic book and all the things that make the lore of this kind of thing work so well. But what they did have was really cool features where you would just string them along, where you'd have these ropes, pulley systems, and zip line kind of things that you could just stretch across your living room and fly them right across the room, so you could have these really cool aerial battles. It was a very short-lived line, but so innovative, worth putting on the list for just the innovative factor. She-Ra. Now, She-Ra is a girls line, one of the very few significant girl action figure lines. There was others, Golden Girl, with, not so the great quality. But what She-Ra had, which really should be brought in as a very innovative toy line, although very short-lived and didn't quite take off, is it was innovative in that it actually marketed itself to girls. Now, there was a very big audience for action figures. A lot of girls were playing with He-Man action figures. Mattel decided, we can corner the market on girls' figures and make them specifically for girls, bring them into the He-Man lore. And she has some pretty interesting lore. She-Ra was actually kidnapped as a baby and raised by Hordak, her enemy. However, the line itself had long hair and that you could comb. I remember wanting She-Ra, but just not daring to go into the girl aisle to get a She-Ra, being kind of gender shamed into not getting one. Now, the action figures were sometimes had some very ridiculous features that a lot of He-Man also had that maybe weren't as appealing or as exciting, but I think she deserves a place on the list for being the one standout girl action figure line. Sorry, Golden Girl. Number 30, we have Muscle. Now, Muscle were little packs of little pink men that actually come from Kikkoman, which is a manga called Muscle Man. And you have many different, you would collect them, and you had a little ring where you could clip them into the ring and just have them bash it out, which was kind of fun.
The people versus Muscle. Millions are being captured. America is safe.
Muscle things, what could be worse?
Muscle Part 2. They're orange.
What I loved about Muscle was you'd get them in assorted packs, and you'd get these like very weird looking design creatures. There was one that was just like a clawed hand that could walk on its own. I remember a variety of different characters, and it was just fun to collect them. Next, we have Indiana Jones. Now, Indiana Jones, obviously one of the most iconic movies of the era, not one of the most iconic action figure lines of the era, as it lasted a very short period of time. But within that time, I think they produced some really great figures there and some great play sets. You had the Nazi truck that Indiana Jones could hang off the back, and you recreate that famous fight scene. You had the Well of Souls, which had the Ark in it, had some play snakes, and some nice play features like a wall that would break apart. And it just was a fun line that didn't last very long, but for me, it was, gave me the ability to play with one of my favorite heroes. We have Eagle Force. Now, Eagle Force was little tiny metallic action figures. Fresh Monkey Fiction is producing their own version of Eagle Force action figures, but they were very similar to G.I. Joe. I remember having this little blue motorized tank that had a cool looking battering ram that looked like an eagle in it. These were very much like G.I. Joe. You had like the Kung Fu guy who didn't wear any shoes. You had the cowboy guy. You had the Native American guy. You had the flamethrower. You had the brute.
There's Captain Eagle and Talon. You can pretend KO is a judo fighter. Turk, a strongman, and Sergeant Brown, a demolitions expert. And this is the enemy, General Mamba.
Right, very much just like G.I. Joe. They were little tiny guys. They were all die-cast metal. What I remember most importantly was the big Eagle Force Fortress, which is shaped like an eagle. That was a prized possession for me of the time. Next in line, we have Brave Star. Now, Brave Star was an awesome Western in space action figure set. And what I love about Brave Star, which had a sort of laser tag like function where you had these packs that you could put on Brave Star and his villain, and you could fire off the pack and score points. There was even a play set that came with it was like a city, which had, a bank vault, and it had play features where if you shot a part of the building, a trapdoor would open, and it had some really weird characters like a transforming robot cavalry guy, like very bizarre looking Western, sci-fi Western themes. Braystar didn't last very long, but for me it's one of those that I think could have made it. That had a few things fall into place. It could have been up there with a He-Man type. Next we have Rambo and the Force of Freedom. I was a big fan of Rambo and the Force of Freedom, one, because it had ninjas. Anything that had ninjas to me was awesome. But it also, I was like one of those kids, we were allowed, I mean, probably you too, I think back in the day, our parents didn't give a shit, and we were allowed to watch R-rated movies. And so I had seen Rambo. And so I knew that the Rambo toy was the actual villain from Rambo the movie, a guy that tortured him, electrocuted him. I found that kind of fascinating. But Rambo and the Force of Freedom had some really good, fun play features. They were a little bit bigger. I love Stallone to this day, big Stallone fan. And they had some kind of brutal weapons and some nice play features here and there. There was a pretty great truck that with some weapons on it. It just was like a fun alternate military set with some bigger figures. Next in line we have Silverhawks. Now Silverhawks is basically Thundercats, but they can fly. They're sort of space police. They were silver, and a lot of times the chrome wears off of them pretty easily. This was another one that I'm almost surprised didn't succeed, didn't go as far as it could have. It had some great play sets and vehicles, and the figures weren't the greatest, I will say, but they all had their wings flapped up out of their arms flapped up, and you have the wingspan, which was kind of fun. I remember the guy with the guitar was my favorite. But Silverhawks was one of those where I'm almost surprised that it just didn't have any more years in it, that it didn't like push forward. We have Captain Power. Now Captain Power was an incredible action figure line, both in that it had a good amount of scope, a lot of vehicles, some different types of space cruisers, and even a play set, and actually some really good looking designs. They were also fairly well articulated 3 3/4 inch figures, which made them a lot of fun. And of course the battle feature was a video game in which you played with your TV. And the way it worked is you shot at your TV with a little ray gun, and you scored and matched up with the video. It would you would either win or you would explode. And when it exploded, your gun would just pop open on your hand, and everything would just fall to the floor.
Captain Power videotapes. I don't believe it.
Believe it, large human. The power of the future is in your hands.
Batteries not included. Jets, figures, and new interactive videotapes each sold separately from Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future.
Incredibly innovative television show. It was years beyond what it did last. It did not last very long. I think that's one of those, had a few circumstances been in place, that one could have survived and really gone on and been one of the greats. But it's an unforgiving time for action figures. The Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line was one of my favorite lines of all time. This is by LJN, 1983, 1984. And you had, what's really weird is there was a cartoon. None of the cartoon characters got their action figures. However, instead, you had actually a lot of more very much cooler action figures like Strong Heart. You had dwarves. You had War Duke, who was a real badass looking villain. Little gremlins. You had some really great villains here that were and that really fueled the fire for anybody who was looking for that kind of fantasy world. I was a Dungeons and Dragons fan later in life. And but as a kid, I was really interested in fantasy, and there just wasn't that much of it back then. You know, it was hard to come by.
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons action figures, a world where adventure never ends. You control warriors with battle-matic arms that fight grim sword.
There is no escape from my evil dungeon.
Strong heart.
Escape is near.
Mandoom and Metaflame with battle-matic arms and shield shooters.
It had a pretty great Fortress of Fangs playset, which I did have at some point, which had a monster that popped out of the top and shot out a little like bat weapon. And if you were looking for a fantasy world to play in, this was a great one. Next we have Lego. Now Lego of the time did produce action figures, and of course, being one of the greatest toys of all time, one of the greatest toy lines of all time, you gotta throw it on the list here. I didn't play with Legos as a kid. I only played with murder and eat things. I didn't build. It was just about destruction. But a lot of kids did.
I know a boy, his name is Zach. He loves to fit, he loves to stack. Yes, construction is his knack. He's Zach, the Lego maniac.
But at the time, you know, Lego now is the main toy. It is the toy that kids play with. I talk about that a lot on this channel, how kids don't play with toys anymore. It's not really true. They play with Legos. Legos have their benefits and their negatives. One, the benefit of Lego is that you make your own world, which I think is so awesome. You can make anything you want. You create the characters, and so they really encourages kids to create their own worlds, to create their own characters, which is something my kids love to do. One thing I think that stinks about Lego is that, other than stepping on the damn things, they're all over my house. One thing that does kind of stink about Lego is I think about how I have like toys from my childhood. I have things that I preserved, a hovercraft, a G.I. Joe headquarters. And I don't think that if you have Legos, you're going to have any toys left that you're preserving, right? Because they all break apart and then you forget to put them back together and then you can't put them back together ever again. And that's just inevitable. So they're an impermanent toy, but they are kind of amazing. They hadn't quite hit their stride in the 80s. They wouldn't hit their stride until they started including things like Star Wars and, you know, using different IP. And now they really are dominating the toy industry. Right next to Lego, I'm going to put, and this is another one I think was better in the 80s, so I give it a leg up from Lego, is Playmobil. And now Playmobil was awesome back in the 80s. I did not use any of it. It was one of those things that you got, I think I had like maybe one Western set or something, but what I did love about it at the time is that Playmobil is another one of those things where you get the characters, they're your characters, you make them up. There's no associated character. You got to make it all up in your head. But what's awesome about Playmobil is you have like a whole world to add in. So if you want to have like a mall or a hospital or, you know, a high school, that could be in the world of your play. And I know this not as a person who had them back in the day, but as a parent who has them now. Some of the best toys ever made are really Playmobil, and there's something that in my house has been used from the day we got them until they put them away. Or if they're like me, they never will put them away. They'll be on a shelf. I don't know. Had to be included. Those two had to be included, even though we don't necessarily think of Lego or Playmobil as 80s action figures. They absolutely were. We have Centurions. Now, Centurions was a really cool concept where you had men with these suits that you could stick weapons on. There was a dog that could command weapons and shoot rockets out of, off of it, which is a great idea from the cartoon. I don't know if they didn't quite make an action figure of this dog, but they needed to. And you had various sea, air, and land experts. But what was great about this were the villains. You had this villain that had two heads, and you had some really interesting looking setups, and you could sort of create your own war machine action figure. They were a little bigger. This was one I really think could have lasted. I'm almost surprised it didn't. It's one of those where you have to look in and figure out, why did this not make it, as it feels like it's new enough that it should have been one of the greats. But it didn't quite last long enough to be one of the greats. And this is what we're going to get in this part of the list. You're going to see a bunch of them. I think anything in this list maybe could have been great and just didn't quite catch on for whatever reason. to go on for years and years and years, the way something like G.I. Joe or Transformers did, but are all some of the great ones. Next in line, we have Voltron. Now, Voltron, absolutely one of the most iconic 80s heroes. The lion, of course, not the stupid ass, not the other one that no one liked, which the vehicle one. The toy line is not quite as great as its IP. It did have a couple of good things. It had the lion itself was pretty much the whole show. The fact that you could take those 5 lions and stick them together and make a giant Voltron, and then you could remove the lions, stick your action figures in, and have some battles. That was awesome. Where the line absolutely falls down, this is why it did not make my top 20 list before, and you're going to see a lot of you said, Voltron, where's Voltron? Why is Voltron not here? I'll tell you why Voltron wasn't there, wasn't quite make the top 20, is no villains of size, right? You didn't have, well, you had some villains that were in like little 3 3/4 inch form, but you need something to go up against that lion, that Voltron mech, and without that, the line kind of falls apart, I think, and so it didn't last very long. And I think, I mean, it's not, you really needed, I guess you need Inhumanoids monsters to go up against your Voltron, because without an enemy, it just isn't very fun. And there wasn't anything out. You couldn't even just pull something from another toy line very easily and have it fight Voltron, because it was like very uncommon to have, you know, a monster or another mech this size that you could battle. Next in line, we have the very weird and glorious Power Lords. Now, this is, again, one of those where you just, I remember walking into the toy store and seeing it, and it was one of those that captured the imagination that you hoped was going to be the next big thing. Next He-Man, the next expansive world, because it had a very cool weirdness to it. In fact, it's one of those things that's so weird that it stands out today to being kind of something very fascinating. Atom Power, and you flipped him around and he had like a blue weird power being that he was. You just kind of like flip him around and now he's the Power Lord.
Power Lords, extraterrestrial warriors.
I am Lord Power, leader of the Lords. Riptide and Rhaegar are attacking. We must help Psyduck defend Balkan Rock.
Power Lords.
But a lot of the design of these was really interesting and pretty kind of gross. Right? Some of the villains here are a little gross looking, and I really appreciated the line for that weirdness, and some of the special features. Didn't last long, but a lot of us loved this line and would love to see it make a comeback. Next in line, we have Sectors. Now, this is one of the most innovative and cool lines that just didn't survive very long. But what's so great about this is you would have, these were, a race of, it had a pretty interesting comic book from Marvel. And this is a cartoon I barely remember, but I do remember the comic book. And it came with mini comics. And you had a whole fantasy world. Sectors had a lot of stuff. So there was a pretty wide scope. If you got into Sectors, you right off the bat could get a lot of figures. But they were a little bit bigger. And they were pretty well articulated. They came with some nice weapons, swords and shields and axes. But what they really came with, and what was the start of the show, or each figure came with an insect that they could use, like you could use as a jetpack in a way, or some of them squirted water. But the main function and the most innovative thing that Sectors did was they had hand puppets that you could stick your hand in and fly around and have a giant fly or a giant scorpion or a giant some sort of giant insect and battle and just put it on your hand as a hand puppet. Very cool idea. Not a lot of things have used this hand puppet action. I think there was a He-Man set that used a similar hand puppet as action feature. Very cool, really innovative, and to me, it's one of those. This one is one of those that really would have loved a couple of more years to see the storyline be fleshed out. And get some more characters. I still have mine to this day. Next in line, we have LJN's wrestling figures.
Are you ready for Hulkamania? Ancient Adonis, looking good and Macho Man.
You can get right in the action in the ring with Wrestling Superstars figures. The big names are here and they're ready. It's corner-to-corner excitement. Match your moves against the other guy.
Now, I was a huge wrestling fan. And WWF back in the day, it was WWF, not WWE. I was a big wrestling fan, and I had the wrestling ring and a bunch of these figures. Now, these were big, giant rubber blocky things, and they were like, it was one of those things where they had a pose, and depending on how cool the pose was, depended on how fun that figure was to play with. For instance, Macho Man Randy Savage was like this, which is great to make him elbow drop, but not necessarily great for making him, do a punch, while others could do a decent karate chop or, whatever. But what was really fun about them was they were giant rubber blobs, so you could toss them across the room. You were never going to break these things. He was the most unbreakable action figure of all time, which was basically how you treated play in general. If you were into wrestling, was you were throwing yourself around, you were tossing your friends around, and that made them really fun. One of my absolute favorite lines, and the thing I probably want to collect the most right now, if I can go back in time and buy right now, is the Inhumanoids. Inhumanoids is one of the coolest action lines in that it was a very horrific cartoon. A lot of the same talent that created the G.I. Joe cartoon and the Transformers cartoon also worked on Inhumanoids. A lot of the same voice. In fact, you can hear the voice of Cobra Commander and Starscream as the voice of Decompose here. But the star of the show here were these massive monster action figures that I want right now. Tendril, Decompose, one that looks just like an absolute Satan character. And this is why it failed. It failed for a couple reasons. One, moms did not want to buy these horrible devil monster looking things for their kids. They were too gross, too creepy. They also had a great line of these trees that could come alive and rock people and all kinds of really great monsters. Where the line falls apart entirely is its men. The action figures themselves really suck. And I remember having a couple of them, and they're just big, blocky, dumb things. What I don't understand about this line is why they went big when it would have made sense to have the action figures be G.I. Joe size, 3 3/4 inch, so that the scale of the monsters is even bigger, right? So right now, if you have Tendril stomp on one of the horrible, dumb, Inhumanoids heroes, it's basically a 40-foot man stomping on a 6-foot man. If that was Hasbro properties, I actually think that Hasbro had the best design team. Visionaries was one of those where I was really rooting for Visionaries to succeed.
It is a time when those who control the magic control destiny. When spectral knights battle evil darkling lords.
What was great about Visionaries, they're slightly larger, but they had the articulation of G.I. Joe, but I was like hungry for a fantasy world to play in. And this had that fantasy world where it also had vehicles that had, you know, guns and all kinds of weapons on them. But the gimmick of Visionaries was they had holograms, and then you could conjure the power of a spirit animal for some sort of power up in the middle of a battle. But otherwise, for me, it was all about knights with shields and swords. And they had a great design. They had a great look. They had some really good vehicles, too. So, to me, that was a tragedy that Visionaries just did not make it very long. Which ones that would you have wished for a few more years, right? Like, I think, like, when you think about He-Man, only had about 5 years of shelf life to become an icon and then died off. A lot of these only had a few years. Mask only had 4 or 5 years to become iconic and then died off. So a lot of these only really needed maybe like 1 more year or 2 more years to really become iconic. Which ones would you like to have seen? Tell me in the comments below. Next in line, we have Dino Riders, and how this did not survive, I'll never know. This was an awesome toy line. You have just a brilliant idea. You have dinosaurs, small figures, so you could actually get, using that concept of having much smaller figures, that we're not focusing on the figures really, where we're focusing on the vehicles being the show. And the vehicles here were dinosaurs. Now we had dinosaurs with built-in weapons, missile launchers, platforms that you can battle on. There was fortresses. There was a massive Brontosaurus set. There were T-Rex sets. And it played off a story where you have 2 warring factions. One works with a symbiotic relationship with the dinosaurs, and the other is like enslaving the dinosaurs using some sort of psychic mind meld control thing. But man, this was awesome. I did not have a lot of these, I didn't have much of this. This is one where I want to go back in time and get them all, because this was like by far the coolest, one of the coolest ideas ever. It's a no-brainer. Dinosaurs with rockets. Come on. Next in line, this is probably going to be the one that more and more people yelled at me in the comments when I didn't put in my top 20 than any other, and this is Robotech. The Robotech action figures, and I'll tell you why I left it off of my top 20 before. I just didn't have that many of them. I only had a couple of the 3 3/4 inch figures. I was aware of it. I watched the show a little bit, but I wasn't a super fan. But it is something that is like, it was a real one of a kind of its time. It was a space opera. It was like a soap opera with space mechs. One of the great cartoons of the era. And they made a pretty good toy line out of that, where you had well articulated action figures and some decent size play sets, vehicles. I will say though, looking back at it now, it's one of those I would like to go back in time and get. Next in line, we have the real Ghostbusters. Now the real Ghostbusters was an incredibly cool line of figures. This is a great line with a great cartoon. Actually, I think this is one of the things that makes this so great. And I think one of the things we need to talk about here is when you have a great action figure line, it usually came along with some sort of thing that helped to build the lore, whether it was a cartoon or a comic book or both. And in this case, we had a really great cartoon. Now, the real Ghostbusters figures were really imaginative. They had great special features, like their eyes would pop out or they would be in fright poses. The Ghostbusters themselves came with the packs that had a long stream of the energy that they would use to capture ghosts. And they would come with a little ghost, which was kind of fun. They got pretty crazy with special features and different enemies and even a really impressive play set. So this is one of the great toy lines of the 80s. Okay, now as we get into the last 10, the top 10, we're going to put some criteria for why I think these deserve to be in the top 10. This is not going to be the same top 10 from the video that I made before. The reason why is I think I was a little biased at that, about what I was playing with and what I loved, not necessarily what I think are the greatest based on the criteria. So now I'm looking at the criteria much more specifically. The order changes just slightly. And looking at what makes a great toy line, we got to look at 5 factors. Number 1, the design. How good do these things look? How close they look to their representation in media, whether it's TV, movies, cartoons, comic books. How well are they articulated? How great do they interact with their play sets? How intricate are these things? The design. Number 2, we have to look at the innovation. How innovative were they? Or are they just doing the same thing as everybody else? Or are they creating something new? Did they come up with play features? Did they innovate in the way they were marketed? Or whatever. Innovation. Number 3, and it's most important because this, I think my channel is mostly about, if anything, lore. It is about lore and an obsession with, the storyline behind. How deep did it go? Do we have movies and TV shows and cartoons and comic books to back up the lore? Is the lore included in the package? How deep does that lore go? And how interesting was it? Number 4, scope. And this is one that one of the reasons why a lot of the ones that are in the back of this list, or I think are maybe great ideas, great stories, and have potential, but just didn't survive. So something that survives for years and years and years has the ability to have a great scope and you have a really expanded world. That makes it more fun because now you can really set up a giant war, right? And that's why something with a great scope is just infinitely going to be better than something that only lasts a couple of years, even if that other thing is like incredibly innovative. Like I would say something like Visionaries or in Humanoids or Dino Riders were really innovative, but just didn't survive. And then finally, playability, a certain X factor that just made it fun. Like how fun was it? That's more of a memory thing. That's more of a subjective thing, but how fun were they? So let's take these last 10 in slightly greater detail and look at where they stand. At number 10, we have Superpowers. Now, Superpowers was an awesome action figure line that gave us our first great superhero figures. Bizarrely enough, there just weren't great superhero figures before the Superpowers line came out. Mego had some, they were okay. You had some in other forms, but they just never matched up. They were never as exciting as you wanted them to be. Superpowers came out, and you finally had, if you're a comic book dork, finally had a Superman, a Batman, and their villains. The greatest thing about the Superpower line was the villains. They picked Darkseid as the main villain and Darkseid's minions. You had his little demon bats. You had his son Calabos, which was a sort of big brute character, and all of his minions had Steppenwolf, and they all had play features. You squeeze the legs, and Steppenwolf's axe comes down. Darkseid, you could shine a little light through the top of his head, his eyes would light up, and he's one of the greatest villains of all time. They also had great vehicles and play sets. I mean, what if Superman doesn't need a vehicle? Like, Superman needs nothing. He flies and he's super powerful, so he doesn't need any of this. But doesn't mean it wasn't fun to have a Superman have a little shuttle that had, fists that came out. The Batmobile, I remember being like a highlight. That had some really great features, an ejection seat, a battering ram front, a little clamp that would come out in the back and capture villains. So there was a lot of great figures, and of course the absolute highlight was the Hall of Justice playset. So this is a great, where I'm going to say design-wise, not the greatest. So I'm going to give it, mid marks in design, innovation. incredibly innovative. The vehicles especially were really innovative and fun. The lore, of course, you have the backing of all the comic book lore. That makes it a great story. The scope, it got pretty far. We had a good chunk. If you had some of the later era guys, you had some very Z-list characters, like Red Tornado, and there were some characters there that maybe weren't like the most exciting, but were hard to come by. That they all had really good, interesting special features, and it was certainly a lot of fun. So I'll give it pretty high marks there. Number 9, we are going to have Micronauts. Now, Micronauts. Okay, Micronauts should probably maybe be higher on the list in its greatness. This was one of the great lines of toys. One of the reasons why I'll put it just slightly below is it really is a 70s line, and it really died in 1980. But it was alive in 1980, and therefore we got to include it. Killed off by the mega success of Star Wars, Micronauts died off and was replaced. I only had a handful of these things, but there's some that I really covet. The two main hero and villain you had that had like robotic steeds, and they were magnetic, so you could pull them apart and turn them into a cyborg centaur character. But they also had a great expansive amount of play sets and various. Now the design, I'm going to give it a very weird sort of bipolar. Sometimes the design is really bad. Like when you look at the generic Micronauts figure, they're just these skinny looking things. They have a weird dude's face. I don't know what that's about. But when you get later on, you get some of the really well designed stuff. That stuff is incredible looking and really some of the best, most innovative designs in action figure history. We have like things like this playset. Some of these places, when you look at this thing right here.
What you're about to see is a transportation system for the Micronauts. These are rocket tubes. The electric air power terminal lets you blast up, down, forward, and back again. But that's not all. You can build a space elevator or any other layout you can dream up. Even run it in the dark.
There's this racing playset. I didn't have it. It looks absolutely awesome, though. I would have killed to have one of those as a kid. So a really great and massive line where it's going to gets really high marks for scope. Just absolutely massive in its scope. Lower on this list than others because it is more 70s than 80s. Micronauts' place in the lexicon of great action figure lines should be recognized. Number 8, we have Cops. Now, Cops is a really awesome idea. We didn't have a lot of cop action figures, but these are cops in the future. They had great special features. One of the my favorite special features here is they had caps, so you could fire off guns and you annoy the shit out of your parents by just like firing off cap guns all the time while you're playing. And they came with, rolls of little caps.
Long Arm is a tough street cop. Sergeant Mace, the SWAT team leader. And Bulletproof's a federal agent.
Give up, you crooks. You're surrounded by the cops.
But they also had other great features. You had, Long Arm, who had, handcuffs that would shoot off and grab somebody. Every toy line has to have their token cowboy character, but he had a bolo launcher that would wrap around your legs. So a lot of really good and interesting designs, vehicles, and villains. Like this particular guy, you could see his brain. He was kind of skinny. We have this swivel arm battle grip. That's the only connection to G.I. Joe. This character is also related to Beachhead, so that gives it. I have some more affection for it as well. I just think Hasbro's knocking it out of the park here, coming out with line after line that were really well designed, really innovative. This one only lasted a few years, but the few years that it lasted, I think it was pretty amazing. So I'm going to give it very high marks for design, innovation, the caps, awesome, and all the little play features made it really innovative. The lore was okay. We had comic books and cartoon that was all right. the scope, it just didn't survive very long, but it was really fun to play with. So there you go. That's my marks on that one. Next we go. I think from now on, we're in the same, your list is going to be different from mine in which one you have maybe in number 1, number 2, or number 7, but we're all going to have this in our top 7. I think these are the 7 that just indisputably have to be recognized as the greats. And at number 7, we have Thundercats. Now, Thundercats, probably one of the better cartoons, and I think one of the better villains is Mumra is one of the only villains that I feel like isn't completely incompetent. You know, every villain in every other cartoon that was completely incompetent, always running away and retreating and afraid of everything. And Mumra was scary. I remember Mumra being really scary. But then you had the Thundercats figures themselves. They weren't the greatest articulated figures, but their size, their accessories made them kind of fun. And also, I think just the scope. We went for a few years. Now we had a lot to play with. The Fortress. We had the Thundercats little car that had some really good features. Or the Thundercats tank that had some great features in it. And there was a lot to do, a lot to play with here. And so the scope for the design, I think they get middle of the road. And innovation, I don't think they're not all that innovative at this point. The lore, pretty great. The scope, high marks. And for playability, I just thought they were a really fun line. Next in line we have, and this one could be somebody's number 1, absolutely one of the few that survives and is part of the pop culture lexicon to this day. It maybe would even be higher on the list as some others. The figures weren't the greatest in that they didn't move very well. So I'm going to give them like low marks on design, but then on an innovation. However, when you get into like the play sets and vehicles, now we got much more innovation, so much to it. And this is where it's going to score really, really high is the next 2. Lore. Obviously, it has a comic book backing. It has a cartoon. It has 75 iterations of a cartoon to back it up. And it has a really interesting and fascinating world, especially when you bring in like characters like Yojimbo or, you bring in other characters into the line. And it also, for scope, it has just like every version of the 4 turtles that you could possibly imagine, even this version of April O'Neil that I don't know why they would make that, but it really has about as much as you can imagine, and some of the vehicles get kind of big.
The turtles are assaulting the Technodrome! Inside are the Foot Clan's weapon storage chamber, Krang's laboratory, and Shredder's master control room! Huh? Turtles? Oh, they've been spotted! Now they'll have to watch out for the I Spy radar!
And as far as playability, they were okay. I don't think they were the best action figures of all time. I think they survived on the scope and, of course, the very powerful IP of the Mutant Ninja Turtles. Next in line, number 5, we are going to have Mask. Yes, I am changing the order if you watch the other video. One of my absolute favorites of all time. I'm obsessed with Mask. I still have all my Mask stuff somewhere, and I had a good chunk of it. But Mask tells the story of Matt Tracker versus Venom, and we have cars that have hidden weapons all around them. It really reminded me of Mask, reminded me of the Spy Hunter video game, which was one of my favorite video games as a kid, when they didn't have very many video games that were good. And, the Spy Hunter video game, you just have hidden weapons in a car. And so what's great is they're going around the world and hiding amongst the real world, and then all of a sudden unleash these crazy weapons. And they were pretty innovative and really fun. Smaller figures. The figures weren't the focus, but what was great about some of the other lines we talked about before, Jason the Wheel Warriors, Air Raiders, things like that, had figures that were kind of nondescript. These were not like that. These figures had some personality. They had some character. And each character had their own mask that had a different power. That was always kind of fun. The cartoon itself was really fun as well. And so I think Mask gets really high marks for the design. Absolutely amazingly well designed vehicles, the innovation, the play features were so imaginative. Popping open the gator and having a boat shoot out of it was so much fun. The Rhino being like, I think, the highlight of the set, with the battering ram, the removable little car with the guns on it in the back, the ejection seat, and the giant rocket launcher in the back. The Rhino is, for me, the highlight of the Mask world, the best Mask toy. So but Mask was one of my absolute favorites, so I'm going to give it very high marks in design and innovation. Lore, middle of the road. I think that it maybe could have benefited from a better comic book or a little bit more of an expansion of the world. The scope, it did make it 4 or 5 years, although by the end last year it would become like a race, Death Race 2000 kind of thing, and it wasn't quite the same. And playability, absolute blast. Just one of the great toy lines of all time. Number 4, I would argue that, okay, these are the top 4 for just about everybody. You may have a different order than mine, but we're all going to have this top 4. At number 4, we have He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. What I absolutely loved, of course, obsessed with He-Man, as most of us were. This is a big Frank Frazetta painting, Conan the Barbarian in action figure form. They were bigger, bulkier figures. That made them fun, muscular, the very similar build, and the power punching action. So that was kind of fun. They weren't as well articulated as something like G.I. Joe, but the size made up for that. And the 6 points of articulation, the waist would turn, just made them articulated enough to be a blast. Tons of accessories and tons of great lore and fascinating storyline. And the scope is massive, with giant play sets and tons of vehicles and many, many characters, which I outline in this video right here. I ranked all of them. There's a good amount of characters that makes the scope of this thing pretty big. Not as big as a Star Wars or G.I. Joe or Transformers, but pretty big in scope, which makes you can have if you had everything, you could lay out a big giant war. That made it really exciting. I'm going to give it, on the design, fairly high marks. On the innovation, very high marks, as they did absolutely every gimmick that you could possibly imagine, from characters that explode to Modulac that can be built into other characters, to characters that smell, and characters that so it's just a really, really crazy, innovative, and fun. It would have been fun to watch the planning sessions at Mattel in this time, as they're just throwing every idea at the wall and making about 80% of what they came up with. Next in line, number 3, and this is my number 3, this might be your number 1, is Star Wars. Now, Star Wars is obviously the king of all mythologies, of all IP, in the history of storytelling. It's the big one and it also really kicked off the action figure phase. Wasn't the first action figure, but it was the first to push for the 3 3/4 inch line, which allowed you to have vehicles, and you had figures that were big enough to play with, but yet the focus could be on vehicles and play sets. And that's where this thing really dominates and is one of the greatest in its innovation. The figures themselves were not great. With only 5 points of articulation, they don't really match up to like G.I. Joe. They came with, maybe 1 or 2 accessories at best. And the design of them, I don't think, is always extraordinary. Like, for instance, this Luke Skywalker looks a lot more like Dakota Fanning than it does look like Mark Hamill. However, where they really shine is in the special features on their, as in the creation of vehicles and the special features. Like, for instance, if you have the Death Star, which actually have like I don't have a complete Death Star, but I have pieces of it still, which is really sad. I have the trash compactor. I have the Dianoga. I remember just like, trying to crush people in the trash compactor, being amazing. I have the elevator, but I don't have the rest of it. So for Star Wars, I think one of the greatest things about it, for design, I'm going to give it a middle of the road, as I think the action figures themselves were not the greatest design action figures. They started off the whole trend, so they certainly deserve a place as at the top for being the one that kicks off the trend of 3 3/4 inch figures, but they weren't the best 3 3/4 inch figures, and they didn't sort of rise above and change with the times. The innovation, I think, I'm going to give them high marks, not for the figures themselves, but for the play sets, which were incredibly innovative and all kinds of really crazy special features. The play sets and the vehicles, right, I think were really innovative. For lore, it gets the highest marks possible. I mean, what could beat the lore of Star Wars? It is the most extensive mythology of anything, really. And the scope, man, you could, if you had all of it. I had a friend who had basically everything. He was like a Star Wars fanatic, and his parents had some money or something, I don't know, but he had just about everything. And man, when you laid out a whole battle, you could have a whole intergalactic battle at his basement. I would go over and play. I didn't have that much of it. I had a good amount, but not that much. I was a G.I. Joe. He was in Star Wars. We kind of. So it's the scope. It goes pretty far, although it only lasted a few years. As of course the movies, they stopped making the movies, and it had to go away. And playability, it gets absolutely high marks for being incredibly fun when you just for that. I think the scope added so much to the playability of it, even though the action figures themselves, having only 5 points of articulation, just don't match up to some of the better action figures out there. And so that's Star Wars. That leaves the big two, and at number 2 we have Transformers. And Transformers certainly has one of the most extensive collections of figures and has lasted the longest of any of these little storylines created for kids and evolved into many movies, not all of which are good, and comic books and cartoons, some of which are great, and many iterations of Transformers. So it has probably the most staying power of any of these as an action figure line. I think overpowering even Star Wars, because if you think about it, Star Wars stays not as a toy line, it stays as a cultural phenomenon, where Transformers has just always survived in some form as a toy. And so I'm going to give that for the design. The design of these was actually pretty hit or miss, in that they were really limited by how difficult they would be to transform and also have articulation. So sometimes they're kind of blocky, dumpy action figures you couldn't do a lot with. Like a lot of times, I think some of the Jets I remember being really, you could move their arms, and that was about it. And then sometimes they were great. Like I remember Soundwave, which I actually have right up there. He really moves pretty well. Like I remember Megatron looking like he's wearing bell bottoms and just not moving very well, and not having a great range of motion except in his arms. And so they were a little limited in their design by their ability to transform. Now you get the new ones; those things are incredible. Especially the more collector versions, those things like picture perfect, look exactly like the movies, and they are articulate, and they can move so well you can really get into a battle with them. But you can't transform them unless you got a degree from MIT in engineering. I got my kids some of these new Transformers, and I tried to transform them, and it took me 7 YouTube videos. It was not fun. So it really is I think they are limited in being able to transform them quickly, which is the fun of having them be able to go from robot to jet plane or robot to tank in an instant. However, I'm going to give them high marks for innovation, because absolutely one of the most innovative toys of all time. You are able to, you get a vehicle and a robot in one fell swoop, and you get to, in one package, and you get to have it transform. And then later on, when they get into things like the robot, the combiners, where, you have a character that takes 5-6 robots, sort of like Voltron, puts them together and becomes a sort of massive giant, or the Pretenders, which aren't the best figures, but they're really constantly innovating, constantly doing new things and improving the function of the Transformers. So for innovation, real high marks. For lore, absolutely one of the highest marks. It has such a rich history, a great cartoon, a lot of good comic books. The scope, now by the end of the run, if you had everything, which I did not, they were expensive. And so I think that one of the things that holds them back is just being a bit more expensive. And so the idea of having a lot of stuff, you probably didn't have a ton. And when you go to the store and you get like a little tiny one, those kind of sucked a little bit. I remember those, like the little ones that you can get for a few bucks, weren't fun. They just weren't worth it. You know, you really needed like a Soundwave or a Megatron or Optimus in order to really have some fun with them. And so building a collection was costly. And that one I think is going to like brings it maybe slightly down on the list for me, and just like, but if you had the money and you had the scope and you had everything, you could have a just war, all out war. And so that means the scope of this thing, one of the few, and I think if you look at the top, you know, what made it to the top, and why I think in this list I reversed my order. I had Mask up higher than He-Man. I got to be honest though, that looking at the criteria, the scope of something like He-Man just lasting longer and having more figures and more things just makes it better. It just makes for a better set of figures. And so pushing Mask down the list. And then nothing compares to this top three. The top three have the most with Star Wars Transformers. And of course the final are the ones that have the most stuff. And the most stuff is going to give you that scope that allows you to really just have an endless world, which makes it so much more fun, adding to the playability. Playability, it's a mixed bag with Transformers because of how limited they might be in their play when in robot form, based on how articulated they could be, or maybe how good they even look. Some of them didn't look like robots when they were in form. When you transform them, they're like, it's pretty much a turd. They transform. But in general, absolutely the greatest toys of all time, and really beyond its years, and something that has survived to this day as one of the great storylines and one of the great toys. So that leaves number one. Obviously, I was going to pick G.I. Joe. If you look in the background, you might kind of notice I was going to pick G.I. Joe. It's talking about all kinds of toys. I'm really interested in toys. G.I. Joe is the thing for me. But I am going to argue for you why I think absolutely I am right. This is not a matter of opinion why it is the number one. Number one, design. The design of the figures is perfection. 3 3/4 inch is the right size because you want them to be big enough so that the figures can be the focus. So not like Mask, but at the same time you can fit them into basically every vehicle, which allows you to do something like an aircraft carrier, a 7.5 foot long playset, the biggest playset ever produced for any toy. This is why a new G.I. Joe can never be as good. A 6 inch can never be as good. Anything produced in this era will never be as good because they're never going to be able to produce something of the size and scope and have it be affordable by anyone. Because I remember that aircraft carrier cost about little over $100. All right, so it was not it was a crazy expensive toy for that time, but it was not crazy expensive. You have things like the aircraft carrier, the Defiant shuttle, the Terrordrome. These are massive play sets that only a 3 3/4 inch line could allow for. The articulation, the best articulated action figure all time. They did have other problems. The thumbs break a lot. The crotches break. The O-ring breaks, and sometimes you got to replace them with a screwdriver. And back then, for me, a big elastic band you wrapped around several times. Now you can buy O-rings because, but back in the day, that was a limitation of G.I. Joe. But they also came with more accessories than any other action figures. You had all kinds of weapons, and you'd have some figures would come with 5, 6 weapons. The innovation of swivel arm battle grip, the innovativeness of the various different play sets and features in the toys itself. And then also you have to consider the innovation. It was the first time somebody paired up a cartoon, a comic book, and created a storyline for the purpose of selling toys, right? What they did when they did that, they accidentally stumbled upon a genius storyteller in Larry Hama. And this gives the lore the highest marks possible, as in, you actually had two, I would argue, brilliant factions creating lore for G.I. Joe. You have a comic book which has this very realistic, very fascinating, semi-reality based and also batshit insane story by a guy who's in the military, by a guy who understands, the way the military works. And then on the flip side, you have the cartoon, which is just batshit crazy all the time and really fun. It creates a whole different separate lore that has almost nothing to do with the comic book, and both are great. And that gives lore highest marks. Number 4, the scope. It lasted longer than any other toy line. Lasted longer than Transformers did of course, Transformers ultimately lasts longer because Transformers always has a presence on the toy shelves. There have been times when G.I. Joe was absolutely dead in the water. In the time that we are talking about, G.I. Joe lasted from 82 to 94, giving it the largest and longest run of any toy of the time. In that, they produced so many action figures and so many vehicles that if you had it all, you could stage a world war that went all around the world, into Antarctica, into the cities and streets of America, that went to distant lands where terror drones were dropped, or into the ocean on the aircraft carrier. You could really have a war. And so the scope, it is number 1 in scope. Nothing even coming close, with the exception of maybe Star Wars. G.I. Joe was on the shelves for twice as long as the Star Wars action figures were. And finally, playability. The combination of the great articulation, the 3 3/4 inch, allowing for the most amount of play sets and vehicles, and having such an expanded world, the lore being created by the comic book, the cartoon, and the file cards, fueling your imagination. The playability is off the charts. Absolutely 5, highest marks all around. That is why it is the greatest toy line of all time. That is my opinion. It is also correct opinion. You tell me your opinion in the comments below. Hope you enjoy that tour of all of the toys of your childhood. If there's some that I left off the list, maybe check out this video where I get into some of the most obscure action figure lines of all time. Ones that you maybe don't remember, but kind of want. And you like and subscribe, and to ring the notification bell. I'm supposed to tell you these things, I guess.